Well, thank you very much, Howard, for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who is participating today. We highly value your input into what our ministry should seek US agreement to include in its new cybersecurity labeling requirements. And for this presentation, my plan is to provide you with some background on the US plans and how consumer labeling works in general, and a bit about the tools we have at Global Affairs Canada to influence the US. And after that, I'd like to give you an opportunity to provide your views on the US program and how we should approach it, and to ask any questions that you may have. So I thought I'd start by just giving you a little bit of context on who I am and what we do. I work in the group at Global Affairs that negotiates, implements, and enforces free trade agreements. So we deal with free trade agreements with specific countries, such as the US and Mexico, and then the somewhat more general agreements that we have at the World Trade Organization. And then more specifically, as Howard mentioned, I worked in the division that uses trade agreements to endeavor to ensure that regulations do not unduly inhibit international trade. So turning to the US proposal, labeling is a type of regulation that we address in my division. And as was mentioned, likely as a result of the SolarWinds attack and other cyber attacks, the US is developing a cybersecurity labeling program. So in May of this year, President Biden ordered the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a US government agency, to create this cybersecurity labeling regime. It is to apply to consumer IoT devices and consumer software, so things like a smart coffee pot or gaming software. As far as we know, it will not apply if your product is being sold to another firm. If you're selling an input, if you're selling, for example, cybersecurity software to Microsoft, our understanding at this point is that would not be included. But one of the things that would be interesting to get your views on is, what should the scope of this program be? What should a consumer IoT device be? So according to President Biden's order, the goal of the program is to educate consumers and to incentivize participation by firms. And they're moving at quite a quick pace. A pilot program is to have been finalized by February of next year. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, is consulting stakeholders, drafting white papers, and is moving forward rapidly. And so this is the point in time when we have the most influence over the US before it's finalized and approvals have started to move forward. So what is a consumer labeling program? One example that you may have seen is the existing widely used Energy Star label. Under this program, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, an arm of the US government, sets energy usage levels in consultation with stakeholders. And if you're below that level, you can apply the green Energy Star label you see. What's interesting about this program is it's binary. You either meet the requirement or not. And this is another important consideration for the US cybersecurity program. Should it be binary, or should it have multiple levels of cybersecurity you can receive a label for? And is that kind of flexibility important to you? Another interesting thing about this program is this Energy Star program is that it requires third-party conformity assessment. So that means that for firms to participate, they have to pay Underwriters Laboratory or CSA or a similar conformity assessment body to demonstrate that their product actually meets the energy requirement. So this is another aspect of labeling that's important to get right. Could you meet the cost of assessment by one of these conformity assessment bodies, or should the program simply rely on what we call a supplier declaration of conformity? So for firms to participate, they simply have to sign a declaration that they've met the requirement. Another interesting thing about this Energy Star program is it's a voluntary program. Firms are not required to participate. That said, of course, there's a marketing advantage to using the Energy Star label. And so there is quite a bit of pressure on firms to participate regardless. And so another important question for this cybersecurity labeling program is, would you prefer a mandatory program you have to meet, or a voluntary program where you have the option not to participate? Another interesting aspect of this Energy Star program is that there's international harmonization. So Canada and the US have agreed to use the same label and the same requirements. So products manufactured in Canada and sold in the US can use the label, and vice versa. And international harmonization is an important issue. And it would be very interesting to have your views on what the cost to you would be if multiple countries have a cybersecurity labeling requirement and they're all different. And how important is it to you that there be one single set of requirements, or as close as possible, that the UK, Europe, the US, Canada, Japan, etc. Would use? So that's the Energy Star example and some of the issues at hand. Now, Singapore has an existing cybersecurity consumer labeling scheme. It's the only one we know of that's actually functioning in the world. It covers all categories of consumer IoT devices, so IP cameras, smart door locks, smart lights, smart printers, etc. So again, the issue of scope of these programs is important. It is currently, like Energy Star, a voluntary program. However, Singapore is hinting that it could become a mandatory requirement. What's interesting is that if a firm receives the right to put a cybersecurity label on that product, the validity period is equal to the length that the firm in question provides security updates. As well, there's a maximum of 3 years before you have to reapply. So this would be an interesting thing as well to hear your views on, to what extent would you be able to cope with a validity period of just 3 years, and what's an appropriate validity period that balances the consumer's right to know whether a product's cyber secure and the cost to you of repeated reapplication for approval. The Singapore program does use an international standard produced by the ETSI or ETSI standardization organization. This organization, ETSI, if you're not familiar with it, is a not-for-profit organization that creates ICT standards. And it has very wide membership around the world, and it creates international standards in the ICT area, including cybersecurity. So your views on whether or not the Americans should similarly be using international standards would be helpful. Finally, for this Singaporean program, they are open to mutual recognition. So they have a mutual recognition agreement with Finland, where if you meet the Finnish cybersecurity requirements, then you also meet the Singapore requirements, and vice versa. Again, an attempt to reduce costs. Now, the problem is these kind of agreements are somewhat difficult to achieve, but it is another way of reducing costs for firms, and your views on that would be very helpful. Continuing with the Singaporean system, unlike the Energy Star program, the Singaporean system for cybersecurity labeling has 4 different levels you can achieve: 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. And each progressive level has an increasing cybersecurity requirement. So Tier 1 is sort of baseline requirements, such as eliminating common mistakes like allowing a default password. It requires, the availability of security updates, a means to manage vulnerability reporting. And then if in addition, you have life cycle cybersecurity requirements, such as threat modeling, a secure engineering approach, a secure supply chain, security testing, you get to level 2. And then level 3, you add software binary analysis. So you ensure there's no known critical software weakness. And then finally, there's the 4th level, which is penetration testing by a laboratory. So you can see this system has a certain degree of flexibility. In addition, for the first 2 levels, as a supplier, you can simply declare that you conform. And it's only the top 2 levels that require you to hire an underwriter's laboratory and pay for that. So there's a certain amount of flexibility in the system, and it would be interesting to have your views on the importance of this kind of flexibility for a cybersecurity labeling scheme, and what we should be saying to the Americans. And then finally, for the Singaporean schema, I'll just show you what the 4 labels look like for the 4 different levels. And note that the label can be put on, your packaging if it's, in a box. If your product's in a box, it can be put on your website, it can be on online, in your posting on an online store, such as the, Apple App Store, or in your printed catalog. So I don't think we should think of this label in the traditional sense of a physical label you put on a product necessarily. So your views on how what kind of flexibility you would prefer in terms of how you actually label a good would be interesting, or label your product. So that's sort of an overview of consumer labeling and how it works and what some of the issues are. Just to give you a flavor of how things can go wrong with the labeling scheme, and I don't mean to suggest this is going to happen with the US cybersecurity labeling regime, but the US did at one point decide that beef was going to have to be labeled with its country of origin. As you may know, a cow can be raised in the US, slaughtered in Canada, turned into mincemeat in the US, and packaged in Canada. So it was essentially impossible to determine whether or not beef was Canadian or American. We had to take the US to dispute settlement, and they finally backed off because it was simply impossible to administer. So just to highlight that labeling schemes can go wrong. So finally, in terms of background, I'll just quickly mention that our international trade agreements have a number of obligations that we can use when raising concerns with the US regarding this proposed cybersecurity labeling program. Regulations are to be no more trade restrictive than necessary. They're to achieve a legitimate objective. They're to favor the use of international standards, and they are to be non-discriminatory. So that concludes my presentation on what the U.S. cybersecurity labeling program is about and what labeling is. At this point, I'd like to open it to any questions you have, and most importantly, any input you have on what we should be saying to the Americans about their regime that they're developing. And a first set of questions I would have is, the degree to which, from the perspective of your firm, you think a voluntary or a mandatory requirement is best, and what the pros and cons are of the two. In terms of demonstrating compliance with the requirement, the relative merits you see of self-declaration versus having to hire Underwriters Laboratory or CSA. I'd be really interested in knowing, whether or not we need special rules for SMEs. If you're a 5-person startup, are you going to be able to comply with this kind of requirement? What would your challenges be? Should Canada be seeking special rules for SMEs that are less onerous, and if so, why? Also, this issue of how many levels of security should there be? Should there just be one, so it's sort of on-off, or does the sort of multiple levels of security be easier for you to comply with, and why? And finally, another issue is, should this program apply to a company's specific products, or should it apply to a company as a whole and all of its products, and focus, on that industry, your firm's development practices? So I'll stop there for a moment and see if there are any questions or comments.
So, let me just say thank you very much for this information, Stuart, and also for your efforts on behalf of Canadians to go out there and minimize obstacles to exports for Canadian companies. So
if there are no comments at this point, I could highlight some other issues, or we could wait, whichever works for you, Howard.
Howard, we cannot hear you if you're talking. Stuart, I think there are a couple of questions that have come in the chat. The first question is, how's the Singapore labeling scheme expected to influence the US program?
Right, good question. The US is clearly aware of the Singapore program, and President Biden's executive order does say that they should make reference to or consider existing programs. So on the face of it, yes, it does look like the US will be certainly taking into consideration the elements of the Singapore program. They have not given an indication as to the degree to which they're going to mimic it.
Okay. Another question for you is, does the labeling scheme imply the product supplier should comply with ISO cybersecurity management standards?
ISO management standards. No, the US has not indicated at this point the degree to which ISO management standards would or would not apply. They have indicated that they are aware of the need to ensure that we don't end up with multiple different regimes in different countries, but how they will achieve that, the US has not indicated. But if you think that meeting ISO management standards would be an important way of ensuring that we minimize differences across countries, we'd be very interested in knowing about that.
Okay, another question. Is there a list of qualified test systems or firms that can validate security for compliance?
So stepping back from cybersecurity and to the more general question of compliance with regulations, standards, the Standards Council of Canada does have a list of so-called conformity assessment bodies, such as Underwriters Laboratories, that they have approved for various applications. In terms of the US program itself, they haven't got to that stage yet. They have yet to determine at this point whether or not they're going to be mandatory requirements in the US or voluntary, and what kind of what we call conformity assessment requirements there will be. So whether it will be a supplier simply declaring their conformity, or whether, like the Energy Star program, firms are going to have to hire a conformity assessment body to do the work. But if you have views on how this should work, we would be very interested in that.
Okay, Howard, do you want to take the next couple of questions? Do you want to ask the next couple of questions?
Sure, thank you. I think I might have my microphone fixed. I'm not sure about that. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So, and I was also saying earlier, Stuart, thank you very much for the presentation, the overview, and for your efforts to minimize obstacles to exports for Canadian companies in this very important field. And there's a comment here that there is a cybersecure certification by ISDE for SMEs in Canada. And this is from Renato Anderson Rosa. So thank you very much for that, Renato. And it's important to seek mutual recognition from the USA on this. Is that something that Global Affairs is aware of and is potentially acting on?
I believe you're referring to a program run by Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Department, ISED, in the federal government. And you're right, they do have a program for SMEs. And you raise an excellent point that ensuring consistency between that program and what the US is developing here could be important. So thank you very much for that idea. And it is definitely something we could look into and reflect upon. Yeah, I can see how that could go a long ways to helping SMEs.
Very good, thank you. And there were a couple of other questions. One is related to the overall concern, the robustness from consumer IoTs. And there are many ways vulnerability can be introduced and exploited, so the cost of implementation can be very high. Perhaps a signal level is better. The ability to identify devices by external sources that are responsible for monitoring, like some recent ETSI standards in CAV and ITS, which focus on digital identity and certifications. So that was one of the comments provided.
Thank you.
Looking for a single level. Okay,
thank you. That's very helpful. And also the suggestion that ETSI standards could be an important tool in this, in reducing costs. So that having a single level reduces costs.
Yeah, and also, has there been any study conducted on the costs to SMEs for mandatory compliance?
No, I'm not aware of any studies that have been done on the cost of mandatory compliance for SMEs. So I'm sorry, I can't help you with that one.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm not sure we covered whether there was input from Canada at the workshop by NIST after they collected the opinions from stakeholders.
I definitely participated in the NIST workshop, and I did raise several issues, including the ability of SMEs to comply, and the need to ensure that we don't end up with a multiplicity of requirements across countries. In terms of raising this, directly with the U.S. Trade officials, which is where we interact, we at this point are collecting the views of stakeholders, including those participating today. So we're still in the research process at this point.
Thank you, Stuart. And one of the other questions that I think is of great interest is whether there is an initiative to have an international program where the main trading blocks get together and agree on standards rather than each region or trade group identifying and coming up with their own standards.
I think the primary locus for that is at the so-called International Standards Organization. So ETSI, ETSI, I know ISO is doing some work. Our international trade agreements do strongly favor the use of international standards when developing programs like this labeling program. And Canada, certainly through the Standards Council of Canada, participates in the work of international standards organizations. There is growing work at the G7, the group of 7 countries, led by the UK, to try and have a more common approach on standards for emerging technology. So there is work ongoing there as well.
Great, thank you very much. At this point, I think we've covered many of the questions, and if you wanted to get into any additional detail that you mentioned you had, that may be helpful. So we still have a few minutes left. We have about 20 minutes left in our slot here. So I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everyone for their very helpful questions and comments. So I might seek your views on a couple more issues. One of the issues is what are appropriate criteria that should be used in determining whether or not a product is cyber secure. So should it be simply baseline requirements, such as you don't have a default password and security updates are made available? Should it include a software bill of materials wherein firms can demonstrate all the different software they've used and that it's cyber secure? Should firms be required to undertake a binary software analysis to ensure that their product is cyber secure? Should penetration testing be required? Should there be a vulnerability analysis or other requirements to make sure that this US program is achieving legitimate objectives? Which of these probably might not work so well, or might be particularly onerous for you to comply with. We've already talked quite a bit about international standards, but again, just to emphasize that, it would be important to know from you, and very helpful to know from you, if there are international cybersecurity standards that would lower your compliance costs. Again, with a view to ensuring that we don't end up with a multiplicity of regimes across the world. And finally, as I mentioned, it'd be very interesting to know your views on whether or not we should be seeking special rules for SMEs. Is Canada's IoT product sector disproportionately skewed towards SMEs relative to Europe, the US, the UK? Is that something that's important for Canada to try and seek from the Americans? And finally, I think as a part of the announcement for this event, there was a sort of a questionnaire, if you will, or request for input that was attached. These are the ways to contact us if you have views, and we certainly would welcome them through the middle of November and even beyond if you have them. So those would be some other questions and thoughts I have.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That's great. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to try to influence legislation and regulation before it ends up being implemented, so that we can minimize any negative impact. And at this point, I think we can conclude our webinar. Thank you to everyone who participated, and Stuart for the opportunity to provide input. Anybody that wishes to follow up on this with a request for the slides can send a request to either Stuart or to operations@intelliflex.org, and we will get those slides out to you. I think if you want to offload Stuart so he can focus on the input, it'd be better to send it to operations@intelliflex.org. And thank you all very much for your time. And bye for now.
And thank you from me to everyone for their helpful participation. And again, thank you to IntelliFlex and Howard for giving me this very important opportunity to communicate with you.